So Diane Abbott needs no introduction. Shadow Home Secretary, thank you very much for being here.
I'm very pleased to be here, although saddened that a meeting like this is necessary. But it was important for me to be here. You have heard some brilliant speeches. You will hear more brilliant speeches. I just want to speak briefly on a couple of things. It seems to me that we are running a risk in this country of going to a very dark place on issues of race and migration. It seems to me that it might be, if we don't come together and campaign very hard, that issues and gains that I have fought for all my life will be rolled back. That is the danger of the situation we find ourselves in. Let me say a little bit about the issue of migration in a general sense. I probably don't need to tell this audience these things, however, they're worth repeating. For as long as I have been alive, migration, the use of the word immigrant and immigration in the political narrative has been a euphemism for race and the other. That's where we start. The other thing to say about immigration, that actually before the Brexit vote, Labour Party colleagues were telling me, oh, you know, if people are anti-Eastern European migrants, that isn't racist because they're white. How could it possibly be racism? And I had to remind them that if you go back to the Victorian era, and you see the way the Irish were spoken about, the way the Irish were discriminated against, the way the commentary on the Irish was a racialised commentary. If you see the cartoons in newspapers and magazines of the time, which depicted the Irish as apes, the point is, you don't have to be non-white to be subject to a racialised attack and a racialised narrative. And I can assure all of you that if you go home and you Google some of the things that were said about the Irish in the Victorian era, they now say exactly the same about Eastern Europeans. That anti-immigrant narrative doesn't alter from century to century. So let's be clear. Any talk about immigration is actually a euphemism for race and the other. And that applies as much if you're talking about Eastern European migrants, if you're talking about migrants from West Africa or South Asia. So that's the first thing. The second thing to say, and it's perhaps a slightly lighter thing, but it's important, I represent a constituency which has immigrants from everywhere, from the Caribbean, from West Africa, from Israel, from Vietnam, from South Asia, from Eastern Europe. And I'm afraid it's a characteristic of immigrants that the second to last group of immigrants to enter the country feel they have license to be negative about the latest group. So many Irish people weren't so pleasant about West Indians, many West Indians weren't so pleasant about West Africans, and so on and so on. And I say this not to make a frivolous point, but anti-immigrant forces will stand up and say, oh, we heard, you know, a Jamaican say this, or we heard an Irish person say that. The fact that it is almost a rite of passage for immigrant groups that are a little further along the road to turn and adopt an anti-immigrant narrative to the newest immigrant groups doesn't mean that the anti-immigrant narrative isn't a racialised narrative. The third thing to say about immigration, I'm saying this because you hear them on the left, I'm not even addressing what Tories have to say. There is a very common notion now that immigration drives down wages and conditions. I've said it before, let me say it again. Immigrants do not drive down wages and conditions. Predatory employers, a lack of a lack of trade union rights and freedoms, and globalisation drives down wages and conditions. As I say, in the Victorian era, they accused the Irish of the very same thing. That it was a kind of big split in the working class, which remains to this day in cities like Liverpool and Glasgow. And I would take some people who are now wringing their hands about the white working class and their wages and conditions being damaged. I would take them more seriously if they had fought under New Labour to bring back trade union rights and freedoms, because that is the real issue. And the next time you hear somebody who seems like a member of the left in good standing say that all the trouble with immigrants or free movement is they drive down wages and conditions, I put it to some of the older people in the audience. When people came here in the 1960s from the West Indies to work on the buses, did the wages drop to the floor? No, because those were strongly unionised sectors. So, as I say, the answer to issues about wages and conditions is not to turn our back on migration. It's to redouble our efforts around fighting for trade union rights and freedoms. So, just a few thoughts on immigration. Why do I think we're in a very dark place? First, we've seen the Brexit vote. Now we've seen the Trump vote. Now, there are legitimate political reasons to vote for Brexit. Tony Benn was always someone that would have voted to come out of Europe. But there can be no question that the Brexit vote has unleashed a tide of racist attacks and abuse. There's no question about that. I'm not saying that everyone that voted for Brexit is a racist, not saying that. But what Brexit has done is given racist license. And let's be clear, they're attacking Eastern Europeans, they're attacking Poles, but they're also attacking black people and people of colour. Anyone they think is the other or an immigrant. They're also attacking LGBT people. The forces unleashed by the Brexit vote are very frightening forces. Here in Hackney, the Hasidic community, the ultra-Orthodox Jews in Stamford Hill, there's been a spike in attacks. The Brexit vote has unleashed really frightening forces. And also, the fact that post the Brexit vote, people feel licensed to attack not just Eastern Europeans, but anyone they think is the other, including LGBT people, including Jewish people, shows you what I said right at the beginning. Immigration isn't just about people who are technically subject to immigration control. Immigration is about anybody that looks like the other. So we have, the majority of British people have voted for Brexit. It's worth saying, this isn't the subject of the meeting, that the Tories seem to have no plan for Brexit whatsoever. They've no plan. I mean, I've come from the House of Commons today, and I was in a speech by the Shadow Chancellor. They've got no plan at all, and that's quite unnerving. And it's also worth saying they're more split on Brexit than anybody else, far more split. And I don't know how this ends. Doesn't necessarily end well. She's looking at me, so I'm going to hurry up. So the Brexit vote has unleashed these forces. It's also there are people in the Labour movement saying, people have voted for Brexit, so maybe we want to modify freedom of movement. Let me just deal with this thing. That somehow the correct response to the Brexit vote is to attack the notion of freedom of movement. It is not freedom of movement in and of itself that has been a problem for the British workforce. It is, as I say, the lack of trade union rights and freedoms. And I am very wary of an anti-freedom of movement narrative, which is actually a cover for anti-immigrant feeling. So we voted for Brexit. I respect the vote, But I am going to be trying to make the case in the media over and over again that you cannot, if you want to stay within the single market, you have to accept that you have to have freedom of movement. And to pretend to the British public that you can keep the aspects of Europe you might like, but do away with freedom of movement is, I think, to mislead the public. It is time people stopped talking about immigrants as a problem. It is time people stopped talking about freedom of movement as something which is wholly negative. It is time people starting speaking up for the contribution of immigrants to this society. And what is more, it is time, and I propose to be doing this in the days to come, for politicians to be saying that many people are frightened by this narrative on immigration and freedom of movement. They are frightened by it, and they need political activists like the people on this platform and myself as a Member of Parliament to speak up for our migrant communities. But the other reason, apart from the Brexit vote, why this is a dark time on race and migration, is the triumph of Trump in the United States. Now, let us be clear. On the one hand, many of the people in the Midwest, in what they call former Rust Belt towns, Wisconsin and Ohio and Pennsylvania, who voted for Trump are people who globalization has abandoned, who felt no one was listening to them. This is all true. But let us be clear. Some of the most visceral support for Trump comes from white nationalists. It comes from overt racists. And although the consequences of the Brexit vote are very difficult and challenging, I think the triumph of Trump is even more frightening because America has such international influence, whether it's the economy, whether it's society, whether it's politics internationally. And my fear is the triumph of Donald Trump, and people queuing to go and see him in Trump Tower, and his people getting massive covering for his tweets, is going to pull the centre of gravity of debate on race and migration to the right. Inevitably. I mean, you can see all the Republican politicians who were saying never Trump and are queuing to go and see him in Trump Tower and get a job, right? It's the danger of Trump coming on top of Brexit, that the centre of gravity of policies on race and migration will move to the centre. So our job, my job, Shadow Home Secretary, job of activists on this platform, is to fight that pressure to move to the right on race and migration. Our job is to say to people in the labour movement, what kind of solution is it for the underpaid and exploited to encourage them to think that another section of the working class is their enemy? It's not an answer. It's never been an answer. And we shouldn't be reverting to telling working people in this country that other working people that have come into this country are somehow the enemy, are somehow the source of their discontents. These, our difficult and dangerous times, we're going to have to continue some of the campaigning we've all been involved in, and we'll be having to go forward with new campaigns. And we mustn't forget the whole issue of refugees. I've been so fortunate to travel with some of the people on the platform to visit Calais. I've also been to refugee camps in Lesbos and so on. And we don't want to be swept into an anti-migrant narrative, which makes it even harder to have humane and fair policies in relation to refugees. But in closing, let me say this. I was born in this country. I was born in St Mary's Hospital, Paddington. And my parents, as was often the way for West Indian immigrants in that era, owned a house. They owned the whole house. They had to own a house of some description because you couldn't get a council house. Do you know what I mean? If you weren't white in those days. So that's why you see so many elderly West Indian homeowners in an area like this. They had to buy because they couldn't get a council house. But in order to afford to pay the mortgage, they let every single room in the house. That's what you did. And we lived in one room, and we had a cooker on the landing. But when they bought the house, there was an Irish family in the basement. As far as I know, they're still there. And Mummy had me in St Mary's Hospital, Paddington, and she took me home. And the head of the household in the basement was called Jimmy. And he thought the world of me. He thought the world of me. Every morning, I'd have breakfast upstairs with my mother, and she would take me down to Uncle Jimmy, and he'd give me another breakfast. 2 breakfasts Diane, then as now. And he just thought the world of me. But this was Paddington, but it was Paddington / Notting Hill in the 50s. And my mother always tells me there was one night where teddy boys and racists were coming down the street to look for black people to assault, really. And they knocked on every door, and what they wanted to know was who was in the house and who owned the house. So finally, they knocked on our door. It's Edbrook Road where we live, just off the Harrow Road. They knocked on our door, and obviously my mother and my father were really frightened. And Uncle Jimmy came up from the basement. He'd heard the noise, because you could hear the noise all down the street. Heard the noise, came up from the basement, and he said to my mother and father, "They are not going to get our Diane." He went to the door, he opened the door, they saw a white face, they went away. What has got to be our slogan and sentiment going forward? They are not going to get the people who are our neighbours and friends and workmates. And we will do what it takes to ensure that persons in this country, whatever their colour, whatever their religion, whatever their migration statement, we will do what it takes to ensure that they feel safe and supported against the horrible tide of anti-migrant and anti-black feeling that we are seeing today. Thank you very much.